Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabesy here. This is the heroic Kilrogg Deadeye encounter. And this fight is mechanically not too complicated. It's mostly about positioning and ad prioritization, killing off proper ads at the right times, and positioning various raid members when needed to deal with the basic mechanics. So most of the fight will be spent having the range group in specific positions, moving appropriately when afflicted by Heartseeker, forcing them to spawn an ad far away from the raid. In addition, there will be ads spawning near the raid, away from the platform that the boss is at, that need to be killed before they reach the platform and convert into larger, scarier ads. Other than that, there'll be frequent ground-based attack that the raid needs to dodge, and melee need to use cooldowns for, possibly. And there'll be tank swapping on the bigger ad that you'll deal with throughout the fight. There's also a sort of sub-shadow phase that you have to deal with that only a few handful of raid members will actually go into and deal with. Now, the first major thing to consider before you even pull the boss is your positioning of the raid. And usually raid markers will help you a lot with this. So you have sort of a few basic positions you need to plan for. You need to plan the boss position. You need to plan the range position and how the ranged are going to move for the Death Throes ability. You need to plan the position for Heartseeker, which targets ranged players, and you need to plan for the Hulking Terror position for the off-tank to deal with that. So if you plan for those basic four things, then you can kind of get an idea of where the raid can be positioned and where you can put your raid markers. Now, as you look through the footage here, you can see sort of those markers that we're using around the room that dictate these positions. So blue is kind of roughly the tank position. We have the green marker where most of the range hang out. There's a diamond shape, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that deals with Death Throes. We have a white marker off to the side of melee for the Hulking Terror, the ad position. And we have a purple position back on the left for the Heartseeker for ranged. However, keeping this in mind, this is our first kill footage that we have of this, so there's since been some developments. I think you can actually improve these positions basically by changing their actual marker position relative to the geometry of the room. So what this essentially means is we're actually mirroring these positions based on the layout of the room. So here's the top-down view of what I would suggest you do. It's basically what we're doing, but we're just mirroring the positions. So you can see in the top of the diagram, there's that little part of the circle. That's the back part of the room where the boss spawns, that giant circle that he's standing on. That's that part of the room. So we're mirroring our positions that you saw in the video by putting the range positions toward that circle where the boss initially starts, and instead pushing the melee position out toward the front of the room where you enter into the actual zone or into the room. The reason for mirroring it is to better deal with the ads that you'll see in the fight, particularly the Salivating Bloodthirsters we'll talk about in a moment. But the main reason for this is that it does everything that the other positions do for you, but it allows you to deal with the Salivating Bloodthirsters a little bit easier because of the spawn positions and the movement patterns that they go through. So this is the suggestion I would use for your positioning markers. So all the little tiny rings, different colors are the raid markers you can use. So if you want to do exactly what we do here, you can do, 7 of those or so. And you can see that the bottom position, the red squares, the boss with tank at the top, with his back toward the ranged, and the melee behind the orange. And then we also have position slightly off to the side for the Hulking Terror with the off tank, a few melee that are attacking that. Then we have the diamond position, starting with green in the front and for the ranged. And then we have a purple and a silver marker on the back sides. These are to deal with Heartseeker, which we'll talk about later. So the primary determinant for your success in this encounter is dealing with the ads properly. If you can kill ads without screwing up, you will succeed in this fight. It's that simple. So the primary ad that you're going to deal with throughout most of the fight is Salivating Bloodthirster. These spawn in sets of 3 or 4. I'm not sure if it's always the same number, but often there's 4 of them at least, so plan for that. And they essentially spawn in roughly static positions, but there's some randomness to it. The main thing to keep in mind is that one will always spawn inside the sort of fell circle in the back of the room there. So you can see one just spawned in the back in that circle. And then the others will always spawn toward the entrance. And they usually come from the sides or back directly center. And they'll walk sort of toward the center of the room sometimes, and then they'll try to go toward the circle. The basic goal of all the Salivating Bloodthirsters is to try to reach that fell circle, and upon stepping on it, they will be converted into a hulking terror. So your goal is to prevent all these Salivating Bloodthirsters that you can from getting to the circle by slowing them, stunning them, and killing them before they get there. However, because one of them always spawns inside it immediately, you will always get one hulking terror add in every set. So the general goal is to have your DPS, your ranged DPS in particular, quickly kill off the Salivating Bloodthirsters that are spawning toward the entrance side and slowing them and snaring them, while your off-tank at the time picks up the terror, and your melee that are assigned to dealing with the terror can kill that quickly. So that's the basic rule of dealing with the Salivating. Now, as mentioned, I would suggest sort of mirroring the positions. Again, go back to that diagram if you need to see it. But the reason for mirroring those positions, which would force the melee position to essentially be around where the yellow marker is to the left of the screen there. So if you imagine that's where the tank and the melee are. The reason for that is because many of the Bloodthirsters that spawn toward the entrance side of the room will automatically walk toward that center line of the room before they go toward the circle. This means that you just inherently get a lot of extra cleave damage and melee damage on the Bloodthirsters that you otherwise wouldn't by having them walk through the melee. Whereas if you're in these positions that you see on the screen, melee can't really help until they're really close to the circle. All that said, regardless of the position you use, you want to, again, use stuns, slows, snares, death grips. Any of that stuff will basically work on these Salivatings. And doing that will prevent them from moving too quickly, and you can kill them off in time. You absolutely cannot allow a second Salivating Bloodthirster to reach the fell ring and empower itself, turning it into a terror. One terror is all you can deal with at a time, so do not allow that to happen at all costs. Now, when you do get a hulking terror spawn, your off-tank needs to pick it up and quickly move it to whatever position you're going to kill the terror at. Generally, this position should be about 15 yards or so outside of melee, outside of any other position. This is because when the terrors die, they will explode and hit anyone within 10 yards. So ideally, this explosion, which goes off instantly, should only hit the off-tank that was tanking the terror. And to do this, of course, you have to keep him out of melee range of the boss. So, other than that, the hulking terror is pretty simple. He will use a strike attack on the tank that increases their Fel Corruption. And Fel Corruption is a sort of secondary energy that players will gain on the fight. If they reach 100 of it, they will be charmed. But if you do everything else properly, you never have to worry about this. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about Fel Corruption. We'll just deal with all the other mechanics, and you will inherently deal with Fel Corruption properly. Anyway, in addition to that, as I mentioned, it will explode when it dies. But the most important thing about hulking terrors is that they will pretty frequently cast a Rending Howl ability. This has a short 2.5 second cast time, and if it's not interrupted, it will deal pretty heavy physical damage to the entire raid, as well as dotting them for 10 seconds. And this would require a huge amount of healing or cooldowns to keep everyone alive during that. But because it's interruptible, you need to interrupt it every time. However, this cast time does get reduced every time he tries to cast it. So it gets essentially 50% faster every subsequent cast. For this reason, while you do need to interrupt every one of them, so make sure you have a couple people assigned to taking turns rotating through that, you won't be able to do it forever. So you have to kill the hulking terror very quickly. Now, because the Hulking Terror spawns the same time that the other Salivating Bloodthirsters spawn, you have to prioritize damage properly. So, generally speaking, Hulking Terror is a secondary priority target after the Salivating Bloodthirsters are killed. Because the Hulking Terror is already converted, you can't, prevent it from doing anything. So, as long as you have enough interrupts covered on it, the majority of the damage should focus on dealing with the other adds first. And then you've switched to the Terror once those other adds are dealt with. So for our strategy, we essentially assigned a handful of melee DPS to help the off-tank at the time, deal with Hulking Terror. And everybody else in the raid, including all the ranged DPS for sure, are focusing on the other adds, the Bloods and the Salivating Bloodthirsters. So 2 or 3 melee DPS off-tank, generally that should be enough people on the Terror. And if it's still alive when you deal with everything else, then ranged, of course, can help out at that point. As long as you get the interrupts, though, you should be fine. The last thing to mention for the Terrors is that they will slowly build up corruption on the off-tank that's holding them. Generally, a tank, we found one tank could do 2 Terrors in a row before they were approaching 100 corruption. So, safest thing when you're first learning this fight is just to swap tank duties every Terror spawn. So when one Terror dies, that Terror tank taunts the boss and holds the boss until the second Terror dies, and then swap again and back and forth. So you're just taking turns. Fell corruption does go down on its own over time. So if you just swap every time there's a Terror, you'll be fine. It's overall pretty simple to deal with. The final basic ability you'll deal with a lot is Heartseeker and the blood spawns that come from it. So the boss will target a random ranged raid member, so non-melee, and that player will get a debuff. When this debuff expires, the boss will throw his weapon or shoot them or whatever, it doesn't matter, at that player's location. They will hit that player and anyone within a straight line between the boss and the targeted player. Now, the key here is that player, when they're hit, they will summon a blood add, a globule thing. And this will immediately try to move towards the boss position. If it touches the boss, it will heal him a pretty significant amount and despawn. So, basic goal, pretty simple, is to kill the blood globule. You need to do this every time, but to give yourself enough time to do so, you want to make sure that the Heartseeker targeted player is far away. So there you can see Heartseeker is indicated by the arrow pointing toward the player. So that druid runs far out to the side, kind of near the purple side of the room where we marked it. Spawns the blood globule far out, and that gives the ranged DPS enough time to kill it off before it reaches the boss. The globules I don't think are slowable, unlike the Salivatings. If they are, I didn't notice it when I was using slows on them, but needless to say, the goal is still the same. Just like with the Salivatings, in the Salivating case, they're trying to get to the fell circle. In the blood case, they're trying to get to the boss. But either way, you need to kill them both before they reach their targeted position. It's worth noting that for tanks, in a dire emergency, if a globule is going to get too close to the boss, you can simply move the boss for a moment away from the globule, and this will, of course, extend the time you have to kill the globule before it reaches the boss and heals him. But usually you don't want to have to do that. It's much better to just be able to kill it well before it gets there. So try to focus on that strategically. The other thing to mention is that the Heartseeker, even though it targets the one player, as I mentioned, it will hit anyone within line with them. So this is a critical reason that your positioning and how you handle this stuff is so important. So you can see that our positions, we essentially have the tank position kind of toward the range, slightly off to the right in this case. So my back is slightly to the right. And then the Heartseeker targeted player is running to the left, the back left, relative to the range group, so where the purple marker is in our case. And the reason for this is that way none of the melee DPS that are all behind the boss are threatened by the Heartseeker angle. None of the ranged are threatened by it because they're further to the side. And the tank, of course, in front is not threatened by it because he's also further to the other side. So if you make a mistake and somebody else gets hit by this, if those players have corruption of any kind on them, which often they will, particularly melee, they will spawn a blood globule as well. And especially if it spawns in melee, it will just instantly hit the boss and heal him. So that's really bad. So pretty simple solution is just make sure nobody except the one Heartseeker targeted player actually gets hit by the throw attack. So even though I mentioned this, that we didn't have any more basic abilities, I forgot about Death Throes, which is very critical. So this is probably the most deadly mechanic in the fight if you don't handle it properly. And it's mostly something for range to deal with. Melee will have to deal with it in that they take the damage, but positionally it's range that deal with it. The basic idea is the boss will channel for 6 seconds during it. And during those 6 seconds, he will essentially cast 4 volleys. These volleys will target random players outside of melee range. So it can target non-range players, it can target melee, if they're outside of melee range at the time. So just be aware of that. This is important for the off-tank that's dealing with the hulking tear and the melee that are near them when Death Throes is happening. But basically, the 4 volleys will target random ranged players, and it will shoot a little bolt at their location where they were at the time. Because there are 4 volleys and they're every 2 seconds, you can essentially plan for these positions. So you see there are range start at green stacked up. When the first volley goes off, they move clockwise to the next position, which is at red. Then the second volley goes off, and they move to the back position at yellow. Third volley, they finally move to orange. And the fourth volley, they go back to green. That's the rough idea. So using this diamond position, we found it was pretty easy to manage this way. That way no one is at risk of standing in an explosion. Another way to do it, if you find that 4-position thing to be too difficult for the raid to handle, you can also just use 2 positions far apart from one another and move side to side. So you have 1 position on the far right, and then when the Death Throes starts, everyone that's stacked on that right position just runs to the left position. As long as they're far enough away, you will just take the full 6 seconds to move over to the other position, and then from that position, you wait until the next Death Throes, then you go back to the other side and just repeat this. If you're doing these side-to-side positions, make sure that you Heartseeker toward the middle. So in the diamond position that we're using here, your Heartseekers go out to the back sides. But if you're doing a side-to-side position for Death Throes, then you want to do Heartseeker in the middle. Anyway, but the rule's basically the same. So finally, we'll cover Visions of Death and the Eye of Kilrogg, which is sort of a secondary realm that a few people on the team will have to deal with. When this ability is cast, you can see there, it's cast by the boss. It has an 8-second cast time. And when this cast completes, it attempts to teleport 3 players that are all standing in the line of 3 green circles that the boss creates. He always creates this line in a straight line in front of his position, wherever he's facing. So this can be altered for the tank that's on the boss at the time by just adjusting the facing of the boss before this ability is cast. This is useful to aim it somewhat more toward the range group and healers so that those players can quickly get into it. If the boss is facing far away, it may be difficult for players to get into position in time. Because you have to be standing in the rings when the 8-second cast time has finished. So the basic idea is that you need to assign 2 teams of 3 different players. Each team will have 1 healer and 2 DPS. DPS can pretty much be anything that you want. 1 melee and 1 ranged is a decent idea, but generally you want to focus on DPS players that have high area of effect burst damage. Because inside this Eye realm, you're going to be dealing with waves of demons. And the goal is to kill off 20 demons as quickly as possible without getting overwhelmed. So that's why you have 1 healer in there to help out. And each of these players will then try to get a buff. So as you've probably seen, the footage I have for this phase is from my alt character, my druid. So since tanks normally don't deal with this mechanic, and certainly not on normal or heroic. So you can see once you get into the realm, as mentioned, there are waves of demons, and these will just enter into this fire ring that you're inside. You want to stay inside the safe area. Don't touch the fire on the outside, as it does a lot of damage. But as mentioned, the goal is to kill off the adds. Each add you kill gives you a stack up to a maximum of 20 stacks of this 1 minute buff. And the goal is to reach 20 stacks as quickly as you can, and then you can exit. The way you exit this realm is effectively by dying, so to speak. You won't actually die. You will instead be ported out of the realm. So the things to watch for in this realm are generally the large demons. The smaller imps have very low health. You can just kind of cleave them down. They do eventually start casting an ability that has a really long cast time, so you want to make sure they die before that. But other than that, you can pretty much just cleave them while you're focusing on other stuff. It's the two big demons you have to watch out for. So the larger, male demon, I guess it would be, has a ability when it dies, it will leave a pool of fire on the ground. So when it is dying, make sure you just step away from that. And then the large female demons will use a breath attack. So you want to make sure you're not standing in front of those. And this is just something they cast. So you get the three demon types. Pretty easy to deal with all of them. A couple tips that I sort of learned doing this on my druid alt, which you don't really see here in this one clip I have it, unfortunately, is I discovered it was better to try to stack up the three players in here if possible. So you kind of would start on top of one another near a wall, and then you can move together. Just all you need to do is keep track of the large demons. So when a large demon that leaves the fire pack on the ground dies, all move away from that. And when the succubus, female demon dies, comes in, you want to make sure you're not in the breath that she's doing. But if you stick together, it means that it doesn't really matter who gets threat. The last major tip, of course, is not be afraid of using cooldowns. This means the healer that goes in there needs to be proactively spamming all their heals, keeping everyone alive in that realm, because the damage will ramp up over time. Because you take damage over time as well as just the demons hitting people. And the same thing goes for DPS. Make sure you're using burst cooldowns if you need to get through the damage. And so once you reach 20 stacks, you can just step into the fire ring on the outside, and you will be, quote, killed off, and therefore quickly teleported back out to the major realm. Overall, this phase is not that difficult. It's mostly a matter of actually watching the timer in the normal realm so that you know when it's your turn to go in. And as mentioned, there's 2 teams of 3 different people each, because there's a debuff that you'll receive that prevents you from doing it again. So you do need to rotate 2 different teams of 6 total people. And then once you exit, your stacks will transfer into damage or healing output. You get 10% damage or healing per stack for a minute duration. So ideally you have 20 stacks coming out, so you're doing 200% damage, 200% extra healing. In addition to the healing buff that the healer gains, the healer also has a ring around them that you can see. And this will allow them to remove fel corruption from anyone that's inside the ring. And the rate that they remove it is quite rapid. Every second it ticks, essentially. So if you have trouble managing your fel corruption stacks, this is how you can get that number low. This is particularly useful for tanks that are having trouble with high stacks. So once the first team comes out, the healer can temporarily go into melee range of the tanks, drop their fel stacks down a little bit, and then go back out to the normal position. Or you could have an off tank that's not on the boss at the time step out to the range position where the healer is. Either way. All right, let's get into the tips for DPS first. For melee DPS, make sure you always stay behind the boss to avoid the Heartseeker throw. Again, watch for the arrow to indicate where that's coming out so you don't get hit by it. Also melee, you want to help with the Hulking Terror spawn when it pops up, but make sure you run away from the Hulking Terror when it reaches about 20% health, just so that you're not within 10 yards of it when it dies, because it will explode and you want to avoid that. Also, don't be afraid to help interrupt the Rending Howl cast that the Hulking Terror does. This usually requires 2 to 3 melee rotating in a rotation, and it will speed up in cast time as it goes on. For ranged DPS, make sure you stay packed up tightly with the other ranged players and healers so that you can move properly in whatever pattern your raid decided on for Death Throes. Ranged also want to run to the assigned position far away from the raid when Heartseeker is cast on you. And once it spawns, the little globule, you can run back in your normal position. For all DPS, adds always take priority on this fight over the boss. And even for melee, don't be afraid to move to a nearby ad to help kill it off, rather than just staying in position. You'll also want to use slows and snares on the ads, and you can even stun them, the Salivating Bloodthirsters you can. Also for the Shadow or Eye Realm, if you're DPS in there, make sure you focus on heavy burst cleave damage for the ads, and when they die, try not to stand near where they actually died, and that will avoid a lot of damage that you don't need to take. For tank tips, pretty simple. When the Hulking Tear comes out, keep it 15 yards away from the melee camp. Also, make sure you help interrupt the Rending Howl casts. You can do it in conjunction with the melee team, or just be part of the rotation. But make sure none of those casts go off. Also, you'll want to tank swap every 1 to 2 Hulking Tears, depending on your DPS, and therefore the corruption level that you reach, so you can keep your corruption pretty low with you and your tank partner. And then finally, healer tips. Again, just like with the ranged DPS, you want to stay packed up tight with the ranged group so that you can move in whatever designated pattern your raid's decided upon to deal with Death Throes. Also, if you are targeted by Heartseeker, make sure you run to the assigned position far away from the raid to spawn the globule far from the boss, and once it spawns, you can move back into your normal position. If you are a healer assigned to the Shadow or Eye Realm, make sure you are not afraid to spam your heals to keep your team alive in there, even use cooldowns if needed, because you want to keep everyone alive in that realm until you all reach 20 stacks, which is the cap, and then you can exit. And if you're on the normal realm, make sure you save your cooldowns generally for Death Throes. This is by far the most dangerous ability for the raid, and where most of your healing burst will need to come from. And with that, I think we covered everything for Heroic Kilrogg Deadeye. Like I said, overall, it's not too difficult of an encounter, but there are a fair number of mechanics. Mostly it comes down to positioning, ad prioritization, and your Shadow Realm teams, those 6 people dealing with that properly. As always, good luck, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. So if you'd be willing to subscribe, I would be willing in return to go to your wedding, or your baby shower, or your bar mitzvah, or your rave that you have in the basement on Sunday night.